Hi, everybody. Before we get to another great interview, the Two Opinionated podcast could really use your help. And it's easy, it's free. IMDb, which is the entertainment database, imdb.com, named us a top 100 podcast. We came in at number 82. That's a big deal because there's 15 million podcasts and growing. So to be named to anybody's top 100 list, pretty big deal for us. And the way you can help is to go to imdb.com, look up the Two Opinionated podcast, and that's it. Just bringing our page up. That traffic really helps us out. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. All we ask is that you subscribe. It's also free, but that really helps us to attract these amazing guests that we keep bringing on the program. And that's it. Two easy ways for you to support us, and we would really appreciate the help. Now let's get to that interview. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Two Opinionated. I'm so excited today. I've got author Audrey Hyams Romoff. So welcome, Audrey.
Hi, Michael. So nice to be here.
You know, I'm excited to talk with you. It's a difficult subject we have today, but it's one that I've had an interest in World War II and the things that everyone went through at that time. Since I was little, my grandfather was a medic during the war, so
Oh,
I kind of grew up listening to those stories. He's been to some of those concentration camps, and none of those stories were good for anyone. And I remember those times, kind of sitting at his knee growing up, where you have this big, strong man that, that you don't think anything bothers. And then he's brought to tears just telling these stories. And he came through, they were empty when he came through, but it was recently empty. So he got to see a lot of, terrible things. And it, to me and to those of us that grew up, close enough to where we had relatives involved, it doesn't seem like it's been 80 years. you know?
no, it's mind-boggling. And that's very true because when my daughter and I went to Poland
Yeah.
for the 80th anniversary, and we were at Auschwitz, so we were, virtually where my mother and
Yeah.
grandmother were liberated, and it was 80 years ago. Like that's incomprehensible. I mean, it was my mother, right? So it
Yeah.
feels like such a juxtaposition as she was one of the youngest children to be
But
liberated. So
still, to be one generation removed, I mean,
yeah.
yeah, that's yeah. And so we've got to get into that. A lot to talk about, but let's start this way, Audrey. Tell us a little bit about your background, what it is that you do when you're not writing. Give us a little bit of your history.
So I run a public relations
Yeah.
agency, communications agency based in Toronto, Canada. We work with Canadian and American clients, and my focus has really been mostly on fashion and beauty and celebrities. And we did a lot of fabulous things. Got very involved in the whole celebrity fragrance launch world. So worked with Celine Dion
Yeah.
and Shania Twain and Sarah Jessica Parker. We launched Victoria's Secret in Canada, so that was a big deal. So that's the type of stuff that we work on.
Yeah. Yeah. The little things.
Right.
Well, so are you, if a celebrity or maybe a large firm comes to you, are you helping them to market whatever it is that they're working on?
Exactly. So we do communication strategy for them, and communications obviously has changed significantly. For example, podcasts
Yeah.
or the popularity of podcasts did not exist. So I've been doing this a long time. So really the evolution was it was magazine, newspaper, and television that was so significant. And then that sort of went through an evolution. And then digital became very big. There's influencer,
Yeah.
podcasts. So there's all sorts of opportunities that I've seen how the whole industry has evolved over the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, and I always have that. Our generation growing up. I mean, we saw so many technological changes in a very short period of time, and it's not like it's slowed down any. If anything, it's sped up.
Yeah.
But the younger people today, much better equipped to deal with all this technology coming in, where we kind of struggled a little bit.
Oh, for sure. I remember, I don't know if you read or you're familiar with the book Future Shock, which
Yes.
was written. So I remember we were discussing that, I think when I was in grade 7. They were talking, so it was a very long time ago. And they were talking about, the intervals between significant discoveries and how that interval was just going to keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And I remember, being 12 or 13 years old and thinking, well, that's impossible. And now it's virtually every day, trying to keep up with the new technology and understanding its applications is a daily process.
Yeah. Well, and now we have, that complication or maybe enhancement, some people would say, of AI coming in, and we're all trying to grasp what that means. It's such a useful tool in some respects, but it's a little scary in others.
I agree. I think, no matter what industry you're in, obviously it's affecting you. And I think it's like anything, it can be really life enhancing, but I think there's some pretty scary applications. And I think, we're not even necessarily aware of what those are. Same thing with social media when it came in, and it felt like just something that was so innocuous. And it was a really great way to catch up with the friends you had in high school and hadn't seen in a really long time. And then, the influence of that juggernaut has had mixed applications.
Yeah, it was so good right at the beginning, and then we immediately screwed it up.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's what you're saying, like about kids and, that generation and everything, they had to go through a whole bunch of things that we never had to.
Right.
And we have to be, vigilant, I think, as the keepers and the protectors of that as well.
I mean, we're not to date us too bad, but we're old enough where it wasn't like I remember having to get used to carrying a phone.
Oh, and they were the size of a brick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it 100%. Was a nuisance to carry.
Oh. I remember so I'm totally dating myself, but when I was pregnant and, when I was getting close to my due date on my first, and there were no cell phones yet, and we used to have to go get pagers, right? So we used to have to equip our partners with pagers. So if we went into labor, we could reach them. And also, it's so funny because when you think about the future, when we were kids, there was kind of like two things that always stood out. Like one was kind of like hovercrafts, right? Yes. There was no cars. There was just, and the other was being able to see the person that you were speaking to, right?
Well, we got that one.
Right. It seemed so crazy revolutionary. And then it sort of just, slipped into our consciousness.
Yeah, it just happened.
Yeah.
I know. I know. It's so weird. And it really has changed how we're, everything about entertainment, how we kind of consume it, how actors are going through it now, how content creators are managing it, how publicists and managers are managing the talent. It's all kind of changed, even to the point where, we don't really do in-person, auditions anymore. It's all self-tape, which is probably an improvement in some ways, as far as time consuming and stuff, but you're missing that human interaction that I'm sure costs some people jobs because they're not getting that chance to be redirected, and so you send it in. If you don't get it right, that's it.
Yeah, no, I think, there's pros and cons, for all of it. And in the communications agency in particular, and, if you're dealing with reputation management, which we do a lot of for companies and for individuals, it used to be very different. The media power was very centralized, and everything was also running through, big networks, big newspaper companies that had protocols and guardrails and all that sort of stuff. And now everyone has a voice, which is great. But when you're trying to manage a company or an individual's reputation, it's completely different. And the ability to control that message, I think, has essentially gone out the window.
Yeah, yeah, agree. I love that you came up with OverCat as the kind of the opposite of underdog. I like
Yes,
that. That's,
thank
that's
you.
because once you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that is the opposite.
Yes, yes, it is. That's correct. You nailed it.
Audrey, so the book is called The Ripple Eclipse, Turning the Tide of Inherited Trauma. And you mentioned that your mother was one of the youngest survivors from Auschwitz. Talk a little bit about that. Obviously, we've got a little bit of an idea what the book's about, but what kind of inspired you to write it now? Is it something you've been working on for a while? And what's the book about?
So my mother, as you mentioned, was one of the youngest children to survive Auschwitz. Her father did not survive Auschwitz. Her mother did. And then they went through. So my mother was 2 when the war broke out. She was 8 when she was liberated from Auschwitz. And then my mother and grandmother lived in a displaced persons camp in Germany for 3 years. My grandmother remarried there, and eventually they found their way to Montreal, where they rebuilt their lives.
Yeah.
But, my mother was subject to so much trauma at such a young age. I think she was always grappling with that. And I think that, she really,
It would have to have like
oh,
lifelong effects. It have to.
and I think, one of the things I talk about in the book is, I mean, obviously, I didn't know my parents before I was born, but from what I can see, so my parents had been married for 4 years
Yeah.
when I came along. And I think it was that. I think it was having a first child that really reinforced to her that, this facade of normalcy, excuse me, that she built in Montreal really was crumbling when she realized the responsibility of taking care of a child and keeping that child safe and protecting that child. Because in my mother's worldview, everything was life and death. So, there was a lot of anxiety and fear around my growing up. So, you know, really innocuous things like going out for Halloween. We were very monitored, not being able to ride a bike. I mean, things that if you talk
Well, yeah,
to,
she was probably terrified to have you out of her
yes,
sight, I would imagine.
yes, she was. And so as you grow up, you don't know any different when you're a young child, right? Because your primary family is your family, and this is what you think everybody's like. But then when you start growing up and, the rifts started becoming more pronounced when I was an adolescent, when I was in other people's houses, and I saw, oh, they're not being micromanaged in the same way. And so there was a lot of conflict between my mother and I. And I think as much as she wanted to try to rein that in, a lot of times she was overwhelmed by those emotions. And she didn't really discuss her war experience. And so it was very hard to have a conversation to say, you know, I'm having difficulty with your behavior. And I think it's because of these things, because my mother clung to a narrative that was her childhood wasn't so bad, that there was adults around her who loved her and who protected her. And that's true. But my mother also was in Auschwitz for, close to 6 months. So obviously, and that was, just the end of the journey. There was lots of things before that
Right.
too.
Yeah, it
So
wasn't like
no,
that was the
no, it
only
wasn't,
part that was bad.
no, it
It
wasn't
was all
all
bad.
good. Got there. So, I was having a really hard time with my mom, and I decided to move to Toronto, sort of abruptly for a couple of reasons. One, I really wanted to get away from her and start living an independent life, and then I had met someone from Montreal who was living in Toronto who was
Yeah.
in law school. And I thought, okay, this is the perfect escape hatch, right? I'll just switch universities and I will be with my boyfriend, then boyfriend, now husband, and everything's going to be great. Except my mother completely fell apart for a 3 year period. And she was like a broken record that could not let it go. And she had a lot of reasons for why it was my fault. But the fact was, it was acute separation anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a lot. Um, to have to deal with growing up, even as a young adult. You weren't that old when you left for Montreal. That has to be difficult because you've got a right to live your own life, but kind of understandable why she felt that way.
Well, it is. And then, it becomes very complicated, the dynamic too, because that these survivors are in fact miracles. And so there are, you do understand why they are still carrying around this trauma. But what I used to always say is, but I just want to have a normal mother, right? So
Right.
like I get it. But it was impeding my ability to grow up. And so that sort of continued. And then I stayed in Toronto. I had some kids. I started the company. And then when my mom was in her late 60s, she started having some more pronounced mental health issues. And, we knew it. We could see what was going on, but we couldn't get through to her. And I had been in Montreal and I was having a conversation with my parents and saying, listen, we need to figure out a system here. Like, I need to bring in help, mom,
Right.
but you need to go on medication. And, my mother was not very open to those things. And then the next morning, we were back at my childhood home, and my husband, my two kids, and we said goodbye. And then when I arrived back in Toronto, I was trying to reach my parents and I couldn't. And so ultimately, what we found out happened was my mother chose to end her life in the garage of our family home. And then my father, the circumstances of his death are sort of less clear in terms of how all of that unfolded, but he was also with my mother. So, that.
That's tragic. The whole situation, because obviously she's dealing with something that happened to her as a child that never went away, and
Yes.
and it it eventually just got to be too much. I'm guessing,
Yes.
but how awful for you to have to deal with that. And I wonder, when you left to come back to Toronto, did you suspect anything like that, or was she was she worse than normal, or was she about the same? So it kind of came as a surprise.
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question. So when I was speaking to my parents the night before, and my mother really was not being responsive when I was saying, like, we need to do these things, we need to do these things. Usually she fought me on all this stuff, and she wasn't fighting me. She was being very sort of sedate. And then my father said to me, it was just the three of us, he said, your mother doesn't want to be here anymore, which sort of, hung in the air. But, my mother had made these dramatic pronouncements throughout my life. So
Right.
I didn't really think, the benefit of hindsight, you see a lot of things that you could have taken as clues or breadcrumbs. But in that scenario, truthfully, I read the situation entirely incorrectly, because I thought because she was kind of calm, she was taking in everything that I said. And so when I left the next day and I was driving, we were in that 6-hour car ride, and I was saying to my husband, okay, we're going to fix this. This is going to be okay. And in fact, my parents were no longer alive.
It sounds like she had already made up her mind.
Well, that's it. And if you read the psychology about it, there's a stream of thought that says when people have decided to make that decision, there's kind of this calmness that comes over them because they feel secure in their decision and they know that there's a resolution to the way that they're feeling. At the time, I didn't know that. So, that was really difficult too, feeling, what role did I play and what could I have done? And, I'm sure you can appreciate that, you get that call and everything that goes along with that. And, my kids were 16 and 14 at the time. My daughter, in particular, was very close with my mother.
Yeah.
And that's why the book really goes through 4 generations in my family, because, first of all, once I had my daughter, that whole thing about 4 generations was really significant to us, because it was incredible. I mean, it's incredible to have 4 generations, period, but to have 4 generations of the legacy of Auschwitz was really incredible. Um, so, we were sort of really proud of that. Um, but that's why the journey, so there was my mother's journey about what her background was, and then what happened on my journey after my parents died, and how it also significantly affected my daughter, who was 16 at the time. And, that's the ripple that went through our family. And the eclipse really refers to that episode when my parents died, because it really did feel like everything went dark.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of thoughts, I think, kind of running through my head, because I'm at that stage where my brother and I are kind of taking care of our parents, and they're still
Yeah.
getting around on their own. They need somebody to kind of keep an eye on them, so
Yeah.
so we're in that stage. So I get that dealing with that kind of cycle as the child, that's difficult anyway.
Yeah.
When there's no other factors, but you had so many other factors.
Yes, that's true.
And I just sympathies as far as your parents go. But I could also see where maybe writing the book would be a little cathartic. Did you find that was the case, getting it out?
It's probably the most frequently asked question, if
Yeah.
I felt the book was cathartic, and I'm gonna disappoint everyone and say no. No, for me, it wasn't, because, first of all, this happened, just over 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And for the first 14 years, I literally blocked my parents out of my thoughts. And I couldn't look at pictures,
Sure.
nothing. I didn't talk about them, nothing. And then when I decided to write the book 2.5 years ago, I had to sort of delve back into everything. And it was really, we were moving houses, and I finally decided that I had to stop dragging these boxes around with me. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go through everything. And pictures were the thing that I was like really kind of terrified of. So I'm going through the pictures, and, I realized a couple of things, which is, there was a whole life to my parents, particularly when they were younger, that, they were happy. They were a young married couple. They were new parents. And there was this one picture in particular, I think it's from before I was born, where my mother is wearing a gown. My mother was very beautiful. She was wearing a gown. My father's wearing a tuxedo, and they're obviously at some event, and they're like beaming at each other, and you can see, the love between them. And I thought, what, maybe I need to take a little bit of a different view on it. But, when you're writing a book like this, and when you're doing research, and there were things that I found out along the way that I didn't know, that I didn't expect to find out. I thought this is just going to be a book about my feelings and all that sort of stuff. But there was stuff that, that came out that I didn't know about. And I also think, it did, as I said, made me examine what my role was. If I had handled things differently, if I'd had a greater sense of understanding. But there wasn't a lot of communication going on about real issues, right? There was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of fury, but there wasn't a lot of sitting down and saying, okay, I need some grace because of this, or whatever. So that was really difficult.
I love this, just for the fact that I'm sure there were a lot of families dealing with survivor guilt, kind of passing that trauma down through generations, but we never talk about that. You don't really hear too much. You hear a lot about those that went through it, as you should, but obviously it's going to have an effect on those that come after, and you never really hear that. So I think that respect, I love that you're getting this book out, because I think it could help some people.
I think, the thing about trauma, and yes, the origin point of trauma in my story and my family obviously is the Holocaust, but there's so many levels of trauma that so many people are going through. And I think people are scared to talk about their trauma, because I think they're scared of expressing their emotions. I think they're scared of being judged. And I think for me, because there was so much hidden in my family. We looked like this perfect family from the outside. And, I knew that we were not a perfect family. And certainly when my parents died, our greater circle knew that we were not a perfect family.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're able to talk about your experiences, then it sometimes brings other people forward and gives them permission to share their stories, because they can say, okay, well, she's sharing her story. She doesn't look like she's falling apart. Maybe I can share my story too. And I think people who've gone through this sort of acute trauma are always sort of looking for someone who can relate to their level of trauma. And so I think it is important if people can speak about it. Not everybody can, but if people can speak about it, they should try to.
Yeah, agree. And you're right. Not everybody's going to be able to, even after so many decades. It's
Yeah.
we were talking a little bit about that. It doesn't seem as far back if you grew up, close to somebody that went through it,
Right.
but it's also, we passed 80 years this year.
Yeah.
Since the liberation, and that's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and that I think it's timely as well. We've had a lot of stuff going on here in the States, and I know Canada's went through their things politically as well. A lot of bad feelings coming up, around today, and some of those groups that are out there that maybe are trying to bring some of that back that we thought we'd buried, in the past. So I'm curious about that. Did you think of any of that as you're writing, just the stuff that we've got going on in the world today, and that maybe this will remind people that, hey, we don't want to go down that road?
I think, we all have to, maybe we've all lost sight to different degrees as individuals, as countries, as governments, about humanity and how we do have an obligation to take care of each other.
That's right.
And I think we've lost some of that, and I understand why we've lost some of that. I mean, the world is a scary place. People want to make a safe place, for their children. They want to make sure that they're physically safe. They want to make sure that they're financially safe. And I think that, when we start focusing on the things that are only important to us, we kind of lose the greater good. And I think, we've lost some of that, and we're so fractured, right? We're so fractured in our beliefs, whatever your beliefs are.
That's right.
And we're so polarized. So I don't know. It seems it's hard to have open dialogues with people who have different points of view than you have. So hopefully there are people that can build these bridges and open those doors a little bit, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. The same thing. We want to be safe, and we want our kids to be safe.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Probably our kids say first.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree. You're right. Absolutely.
How's your daughter doing with the book? Is she she excited to get it out, or was it how did she kind of take the whole process? Because obviously it affects her too.
Oh yeah, it does. And to be clear, she knew about the project from the beginning. I would not have included anything about her if she didn't want me to. My daughter is, she's pretty fierce, and she really believes in putting her viewpoints out there. And, she really did have a number of traumatic years. And, we both went through therapy. We didn't talk about our experiences for a very long time. I talk a little bit about that in the book. I didn't bring it up with her. She in particular, because my son was younger, and I think, girls sort of are more nurturing, or in that case, it was,
Sure.
But, she felt like she had to take care of me. So there was this very weird generational leapfrog that happened, right? Because, when you lose, a parent, an older
Right.
parent, there's another parent to take care of. And that's where all the focus goes. But in my situation, because I lost both my parents at the same time, all of a sudden we all got thrown up the ladder. And so, my 16-year-old daughter didn't leave my sight. My 16-year-old daughter is trying to process what's going on. And, I'm trying not to fall apart because I'm trying to be strong for my kids. I
Yeah.
was sometimes successful, sometimes not successful, but the short answer is my daughter's doing great. She's, found a career that she loves. She's doing amazing in it. She just landed a huge project and I'm super proud of her. And, we have an amazing relationship. I mean, I have a great relationship with both of my kids. And, that was so important to me after having such a difficult relationship with my mother that I
Yeah.
absolutely did not want to replicate that. I had to figure out how to let my kids be who they wanted to be. I could still be overbearing. I could still inflict my will. I'm sure, if my kids see this, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're really easygoing." I wasn't easygoing, but I love and respect my kids, and will always be there to support them. But they have to make their own decisions.
Yeah, I love that, and that's not always easy as a parent to do.
No,
Kind of stepping out of the way a little bit, but being close enough that if they need us, we're right there.
that's exactly
Yeah, it's not easy, um, but good for you for working through that. And has it been so writing the book wasn't very cathartic? Has it been difficult? Having to get out there and talk about it, or has that been helpful?
it's interesting. Like some interviews, some experiences about talking about it are harder than others, and
Sure.
I'm not sure why. Just like in the process of living after my parents passed away, when that anniversary comes up around October 1st, it's never easy, but some years it's really, really bad. And some
Yeah.
years it's like, okay, I can keep that, in the box. Um, but I think, if I'm going to tell my story, I would like people to know the story. And, one of the chapters in the book talks about some difficult things that happened to people who were very, very close to me and people who had supported me at the time of my parents' death and who I, have helped support through their difficult times. And I think that's a big message too, which is, just show up for people. And I don't, yes, I mean, you can do grand gestures, you can do things on a large scale. People get overwhelmed by that and weighed down by it. But sometimes just supporting the people in your life, and I think having that empathy, I would say that is what sort of took me on a bit of a more cathartic path and taught me a little bit more about gratitude. So ironically, it wasn't so much the path of writing about it, it was just the natural evolution. Listen, the older we get, the more bad things are going to happen. And, I want to support the people who need me, who supported me when I needed them.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that's a really good, healthy attitude to have with that. The book also talks about your grandfather. There was a little mystery about what may have happened to him, but if I remember right, uh, he passed on the way to.
Yeah,
Not
to
he didn't
Dachau.
actually arrive at Auschwitz.
No, my mother and my grandmother were on a train bound for Auschwitz. My grandfather was on a train bound for Dachau. My grandfather never made it off the train alive. And the story that I was always told was that he had suffocated on the cattle car, which was an entirely plausible
Yeah,
story.
that
Um,
does.
but there was another narrative. So one of the things when I was talking about going through the process of this book and finding out things that I didn't know beforehand, one of them was that, my grandfather, it appears that my grandfather was a member of the Jewish police in the ghetto in Poland where my family was interred, called
Yeah,
Thomas. And I heard about it a few years ago through someone I was collaborating with and helping do some research. And he sent me an email that had an image of a page from a ledger that had my grandfather's name on it. And then it also recorded, that he was being paid. And I was, that's absolutely incorrect. That's not true. And, he had written his own book. His name is Malcolm Brabant, and he is who I went to Poland with for PBS, and he wrote a book called Daughter of Auschwitz. So he absolutely had a lot of information. He was a credible source. He's an incredible journalist. And I was still saying, no, I don't think that's correct. But when we went to the town where the records were held, there were ledgers, and there was a woman named Justina Burnett who wrote a book about the Jews of Tomashov and had done all the research. And, there were ledgers that showed that, in fact, my grandfather appeared to have been paid by the Jewish Council. And there was a debate, an internal debate, and also debate with family members about whether I should include that information in the book or not. And ultimately, I did include it because I think if I'm being truthful about what the situation is, I have to be truthful about that too. I don't know exactly what role my grandfather played, nor did he have a choice in what, if he was appointed to this position, right, presumably he could have turned it down. Most likely he wouldn't have survived that decision. And he did have some privileges because of his role. And when we were in Auschwitz, there was a museum curator there who I was speaking to, and some other people who are absolutely, convinced that the only reason that my mother and grandmother had a chance of surviving was because my grandfather, was able to maneuver some things because of his position. So then in terms of what happened to my grandfather, I don't have any definitive proof about what happened on the train. I just know that there is another narrative that says that he didn't necessarily die of natural causes, that there was someone who was potentially involved in his death, and maybe that was a result of his affiliations, but I don't know that to be true.
Yeah, and that's I'm sure that's difficult. That not knowing, the decisions that were having to be made at that time just boggle my mind. I don't know how anybody could have, made those type of decisions. There was no good decision.
It's true.
And he very well could have had a hand in kind of at least putting them in a position where maybe they could survive. It's difficult for me to think about, what would I do? I'm trying to save my family.
Wife and two.
What do you do in those situations? I don't know.
Well, right. I think it's always a case of, walk in someone's shoes. But, just to be clear too, it is not like those. So the people that were running the ghetto was the Jewish Council, who was, they were instructed by the Nazi hierarchy to establish this Jewish Council. And then the Jewish Council was mandated to establish this Jewish police contingent. This did not protect these people. This did not mean that they and their family survived. It didn't mean that they survived. So I think, I just don't want to be misleading and say, well, they did this because they knew it was a guaranteed path of survival.
Well, that's right. That's right. They probably had no choice when you get right down.
No, I think they had no choice. And, I agree with you. How does, honestly, thank God, none of us have to make these decisions.
That's right. Yeah, it's just a time period in our existence that I hope we never go back to. But I'm a little worried. Worried. Anything from the book that you would like people to know? If they're considering reading, anything that you want to get out there.
I think intergenerational trauma is a lot more prevalent than we think it is.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things about the book, because I think when you hear about, this topic and what happened with my parents, you think, well, this is going to be a very dark book and it's going to be, very depressing. And there's obviously some very difficult topics that are discussed. but it really is told from the point of view of, me growing up. And so not every minute was terrible.
That's right.
There was a lot of like really silly things that happened with my parents and my friends and all that sort of stuff. So I think it is a story about, what it's like to grow up in that type of household. And, for example, like I became super rebellious when I was an adolescent because my mother was really trying to clamp down on me. So,
Right.
how am I reacting to that? Well, I'm, stealing whiskey sours off the bars at bar mitzvahs. And, growing up in Montreal, they, you could get cigarettes when you were 12 years old. My
Yep.
friends and I were walking around, 12-year-old with cigarettes. We started going to discos in Montreal when we were 15. Montreal was a very, very good place to be an adolescent if you felt that. I have to tell you, it's not, I don't think it's like that anymore. But um, so I think people can relate to that piece of it too, right? So
Yeah.
it's not, and I don't think, or at least I hope, that everyone's life, even when you're struggling through it, it's not just dark, right? It's this spectrum of light and dark. And that's what I tried to capture, in the book about my adolescent insecurities, about starting a company and deciding to have a baby 4 months later, and really, really, because of course, why would that be a problem? So, it's also touches on being a woman entrepreneur, the choices that I made.
Yeah.
And, the way it ties back to my family is that I think that I was, you know, trying to be super ambitious. Like I did not consider my mother necessarily a overly productive member of society. And so, I was living my life in diametric opposition of that. So,
Yeah.
if she's not going to be a working mom or whatever, like I'm going to do everything. And, a lot of my decisions were ridiculous.
Right. Well,
So
all of us do that
yes,
after growing up.
yes. So, I think it's a journey of a life, and a life has a lot of different components to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it also talks some about your dad, and I think it's interesting, how he handled the whole situation, because obviously they were happy at times,
Yes,
and he's had to deal with that, and probably deal with maybe parts of it that you're not aware of.
well,
It usually happens between
absolutely.
spouses, but I think that's kind of interesting.
I there's a line in the book that says, in life, um, my mother dominated, but in death, it was my father, because my father and I were exceptionally close. My father was an incredible human being.
Yeah.
He was a doctor. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was an amazing dad. And when they both passed away, so complicated with my mother, um, but not. But when my relationship with my father wasn't complicated. My relationship with my father was just about unconditional love, and so his loss in a lot of ways has been the hardest thing to deal with.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, and just terrible that you lost both of them at the same time, and that good for you for um, taking some of that and making something positive with it. So the book is The Ripple Eclipse: Turning the Tide of Inherited Trauma, and I think it came out a couple days ago, right? It's
Yeah,
it's like out there now.
yeah, just came in 2 days ago.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's
Yes,
exciting. I know the subject matter is heavy in parts, but that has to be kind of thrilling to get a book out about your life. I mean, that's amazing.
yeah. I mean, it's really a process. I'm a first time author, so I had a very naive view of how this was all going to go, which I was disabused of many years ago. Which the struggle to write a book, and then having people weigh in on the book, and having to edit the book, and then
Right.
finding someone to publish a book, and then market the book.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It, no, it's not easy. I feel like it's sort of like being pregnant, and giving birth. But I'm grateful. I'm grateful that it's out there. I'm very grateful to my publisher, who took this book on when really nobody else was, like nobody. And so, trying to just do my best to get it out there and hope that other people can relate to it and maybe feel better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think they will. I think they will. Are you doing any book signings?
You know what? It's all like it just happened. And so yes, there is a launch event, our first launch event that's happening next week. It's not a book signing, but
That's
it is an
exciting.
event and that all that stuff is coming. Yeah, spending a lot of time talking about the book. And I'm very grateful for people like you, Michael, who are interested in learning more about it.
Of course. Yeah, of course. So Audrey, before we wrap up, go through, where we can find the book, and then, where we can find you on social media. I know you've got a website as well. So kind of go through all that.
Okay. So you can order it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble. If you want to order it online, I have a website, which is just audreyhymesromoff.com. And my socials are all at Audrey Hyams Romoff.
Well, Audrey, thank you so much for taking a little time, to tell this story and to talk a little bit about your family and the history. And I know even with all the difficult times, obviously your mother was kind of an amazing woman. To survive that, that's just unbelievable. So.
I think
Don't
that's
want to lose sight of that. I know she had trouble there near the end, but
no, I think
obviously amazing
it's a
woman.
really good call out because one of the things, that was difficult was having a renewed appreciation for who she was and not being able to say that to her. So, that's one of the difficult outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, you've taken and done the next best thing. You've written about it and you've kind of put that out there. So it's not just a resource for your family, but I think for a lot of families, and I good for you for writing it. I know I'm going to get my copy. I told you I'm kind of a history type of guy, and I love reading about that. And I think your story just in particular, really interesting because you took all this, created your own company, made a whole business. I mean, that's an amazing story. So it's a lot of positives with this tragic story.
There are, and that's why the gratitude is important.
That's right. That's exactly right. All right, Audrey, hold on one second. Audrey Hyams Romoff. The book is The Ripple Eclipse, Turning the Tide of Inherited Trauma. Good for her for writing this story. That's I just can't, it's such a difficult subject anyway. I can't imagine actually writing it about your mother and grandmother. It's just amazing. If you're like me, you're interested in World War II and the Holocaust and the things that came from that decade and a half. The Ripple Eclipse is definitely a book that you'll want to read. If you've got family members that survived the concentration camps, I think The Ripple Eclipse is definitely something you would want to read. If you're interested in a success story, someone that came out of generational trauma and was able to make something positive of it. Audrey created her own media company, and she's out there working with celebrities, doing marketing, and now she's writing a book. I mean, this is a positive story as well. So if you're a fan of those types of success stories, I think this book is for you as well. Thank you guys for tuning in with us. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. Please subscribe, really helps us out. Our website's meistercon.com. You can find over 1,000 episodes, audio and video versions for doing anything in studio, covering a convention, going on location. Anything we have going on will be on the website, meistercon.com. So please check us out there. Thank you guys so much. Till next time. Bye, everybody.